Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. Last episode of our podcast, we interviewed one of our team members, Nii Codjoe, who talked about this idea of living a life of leftovers. And it was a really great conversation. If you haven't heard it, please go back and listen to it. But then afterwards, we had this equally interesting conversation around the topic of making an impact and last week I talked about us being crusty Gen Xers and Nii having this cool, fresh millennial perspective. But the conversation that extended after that podcast was this idea of how millennials define impact and everybody wanting to make an impact. And it was just such a fascinating conversation. I was like, we need to record a second podcast and we need to make sure this gets in. So welcome back to the show, Nii.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to immediately kick the can over to you or kick the conversation over to you. If you don't have context, Nii, again, is a team member of ours. He's an ENTJ, and he's got all these really great ideas. And I'm just going to kick the conversational piece over to you about this idea of making your mark and what that means to people of like a younger generation. So, yeah, can you shed some light on what all that means?
So I live in Atlanta, and we just had the Super Bowl here not long ago. And my wife and I, her name is Anandi, she's an INTJ. We had this really interesting conversation about the role of competition in our culture and how much our culture adores competition and how much we see it as a virtue. And we were talking about how, at least for a lot of millennials, I feel like social media has amplified this spirit of competition, right? We go on social media, you pull up your phone, you go on social media, maybe it's Facebook, Instagram, who knows? And immediately you see pictures of people doing remarkable things, just remarkable things. These are like statistical anomalies, but it feels like this is what the average person is doing, right? You see people with remarkable careers, you see exceptionally beautiful people, you see just like anything that's exceptional, it's all in front of you. And it's so easy to start to feel inadequate. It's so easy to feel like, man, I'm not good enough. I need to get my act together. And really, I feel like it's made it hard to be happy. When I talk to, when my wife and I, when we talk to our friends that are young adults in their 20s and 30s, we just see it. We just see this, sense of urgency that what I'm doing right now is not enough. Living my life is not enough. I have to do more than just that. And it feels like a phenomenon that has just evolved or emerged over the last maybe 10 years. I think before that, most people went through their life just taking care of their family, they had a career or a trade, and they were content with the life they had. But now we have a situation where that's not enough. It's not enough to just have a family. It's not enough to just have a cool career. You have to make a big impact in the world, and it has to be this global thing. It has to be this huge thing. And if you're not doing something that's huge, you're not doing anything.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend of mine who's an older millennial, like 35-ish. And I was mentioning some of the challenges I had with like the millennial generation mind frame as an Xer. And she mentioned that another part of this isn't just the competitiveness of social media. It's also that the millennial generation was sort of raised to believe that, they're the ones who are going to end the pollution crisis, and they were the ones who were supposed to take care of the environment. And so there's also a lot of embedded language as they were growing up that said that they were responsible to do all of these big things in the world. They were the ones who were like, it starts with you. And I started remembering just little things, like if you go to Disney World, there's a Simba ride at Epcot Center that very much talks about how we have to be really responsible for the environment we live in, which is great because I think a lot of environmental messages started becoming more and more pronounced in the 90s, and it's because of our heightened awareness of it. But I think it impacted the generation growing up during that time period as thinking that they were the ones who were supposed to do it. So now with this idea that got infused in their minds of like, I'm supposed to be part of this global solution. And then now they're in their 20s and 30s and they're looking at everybody else that seems to be living this high life. And the sense of inadequacy, I mean, I can't even imagine the sense of inadequacy, because as an Xer, I look at these and I'm like, oh, those are highly curated pictures. I can just tell. That's like, yeah, if your Instagram is just filled with one shot of travel, after another, or one shot of like amazing experience after another, there's a lot of hard work that goes into that. There's a lot that goes into a lifestyle like that. So I think there's this idea of the sense of general inadequacy that people of a younger generation can feel if they're comparing themselves to not only the message that they grew up with, but then this idea that maybe everybody else is on, they're on script and I'm the one that's not on script.
Yeah, I remember reading a statistic or something somewhere, I don't know the source, talking about how a lot of people under the age of 40, particularly 20-somethings, will pick an activity they're going to do on that weekend based on how well it will photograph and play to something like Instagram on social media. And, hey, you want to go do this fun activity? And somebody would actually love to go do the activity, but it wouldn't really be a great optic for them in their life around what we're talking about here. And so they choose activities they may not have actually enjoyed or wanted to do because they knew that would look better on social media. And I thought that was really interesting. And it speaks to this idea of the pressure we have of this competition you speak to, Nii, where it's like, wow, like I look at my friends and other people I know, and we used to live hundreds of years ago in villages with like 100, 200 people that we compared ourselves to. Now we're comparing ourselves to the best of the best on a global scale all the time, and we're seeing it every minute on Instagram and social media. And so like, I got to keep up. I got to make sure I go to that cool new hip restaurant in town that just opened with some of my cool friends, because we got to get an Instagram shot to not look like we're slipping by. If I'm not on Instagram or if I'm not on social media, I don't exist. So I've got to make sure I perform and get over there. And I'm not saying this is everybody, but I think a lot of times, I even feel it. Like for Personality Hacker, we're at a meetup in Toronto a couple weeks ago, and I was like, oh shoot, I should be Instagramming this. This is like, I felt almost obligated to be social mediaing something. And I was like, no, I'm talking to people, I'm connecting, I'm enjoying the moment and the experience. We got a couple pictures. But if I took every moment to go get selfies with everybody, I'd lose the experience itself. But I even feel that pressure of competition that you're talking about. This idea of there's like a pressure to do something big, but there's also a pressure to display big as well. Almost like a peacocking nature to our lives that we're encouraging each other in this dynamic. And I think it really speaks to what you're saying is there's almost this pressure, this feeling like I've got to keep up. I can't slow down. And it's more now than ever before.
Well, and I wonder if part of the reason why younger people feel that pressure more, I mean, I think we feel it a little bit, but not nearly to the degree that younger people do. I wonder if it's because they're trying to obey that message that they got when they were young. So how they display on social media is a part of them thinking that that's their obligation. Their obligation is to be living so big.
That, or it could be the currency of our time. It could be the marker. I mean, I don't know how many people you know, Nii, about that, like are social media influencers or at least aspire to be social media influencers. Like if I only get a big enough following, Nike or some big brand will pay me to talk about their product. And the currency is that I've got to be like the Kardashians or something and get up there. And I don't think this is everybody. In fact, you listening, this is probably not you. We don't tend to attract a lot of audience, people listening to this show that have that wiring. And yet it still is something that even if it's not something natural or it's like a compulsion, like a Kardashian family, it still is so pervasive. I think we all tend to like struggle with it because it seems like, oh, that's the currency. We have to be like, fame is like the new currency in a way. And unfortunately, to be famous in our time and age doesn't require a lot of substance. And it feels like if I can just get famous, that will also make the impact in the world. You see a lot of celebrities endorsing special causes or social media influencers trying to help this cause or that cause. And it's almost like there's this synthetic nature of putting myself in a position where I'll have the power to be able to say something or speak to something to make a difference in the world. And I'm sure you're going to speak to some of the underpinnings of maybe there's more substance we could build as people than just going down that road. I don't know.
Yeah, to both of your points, there's this intense pressure to perform. It's before we kept hearing the phrase, we've all heard the phrase keeping up with the Joneses, right? And usually like oftentimes when people have used that phrase in the past, we're talking about like our neighbors or coworkers, the people that are kind of in our local community. But now we're not keeping up with the Joneses. We're keeping up with the best of the best of the best in the world, right? There are billions of people on this earth. Let's take the top of the top. Those are the people that we're competing with. And what it does is it creates a condition or circumstance where we're setting ourselves up for failure. Right? Because again, statistically, the number of people that are going to be famous or like make a quote unquote big impact in the world, which I often think, by the way, is really code for famous. I think you're right. I think fame has become the new currency. And when a lot of people think about making an impact in the world, that's a lot of what they think about.
They want to be recognized for making a big impact in the world, not necessarily having made the impact.
Exactly. My wife Antonia and I like to call this the make your mark myth. And it's this common misperception that you're only making a big impact in the world if you're curing cancer or you have 1 million followers on Instagram and you endorse a couple good causes in the world. Like that's what it means to make a mark in the world. And unless you're doing something big, unless you're famous, unless you have a lot of followers and likes, you're not making an impact in the world.
Yeah, which is such a different definition or picture in a head of impact than what I have. Like it's almost like this concept of I just want to make an impact in the world. Like the assumption is we all have the same picture in our head of what impact means. But I think that was the reason why I was like, we have to do a second podcast because of that concept right there. That when we say I'd like to make an impact, we might not all have the same picture in our heads. And this makes me think of, what was it, a Nike commercial in the last year or so? Do you remember? It was like, don't even, I just remember leaving the commercial with this idea of like, I'm not even going to try unless I'm number one in the world. Do you remember that commercial?
It was like something like, don't become the best at this sport. Like go become the best in the world at athleticism in general. I think it was that Colin Kaepernick commercial that came out a little while ago.
Yeah. And of course, all the attention got put on the idea that it was like, it was like sort of embedding itself into sort of this politicized debate. But I remember just watching it for the overall message, which was like, don't become the best in your field, like become the best on the planet, or don't just leave a mark in this one industry, leave a mark on everything. And I was like, man, that is quite a bar to set for young people. And no wonder people get overwhelmed with that idea.
And the sad, sobering truth is we can't all be the best, right? If we were all the best, then we would have to redefine what best looks like, right? It's an unfortunate truth. And I think what has happened is a lot of millennials feel like either I make a huge impact in the world or I do nothing. There's no transition. And people feel like I have to go from 0 to 100 overnight. And if that doesn't happen, then there's something fundamentally flawed with who I am. And our media just perpetrates this perception when we tell these really neat stories of people that are successful overnight. These young tech entrepreneurs that are billionaires, or these remarkable athletes, or these young models, or whatever it is. We just keep hearing that message again and again. And I think it's actually warped our perception of what impact and success looks like.
Yeah, I see this as a business owner. I see this in younger people who don't want to start their career anywhere that they perceive as a bottom rung, that they want to come in as a visionary, or they want to come in like immediately taking over without having, not even taking over, but they want their voice heard and they want to make sure that they have a seat at the table. And I thought before it was like hubris. I thought it was like they just thought that they were super important. But I think I've redefined that as in this idea that if they have to work their way up, and this concept of like you've talked about career capital in the past, that if they have to build career capital over time, that's somehow a failing on their part, that they failed because they didn't just enter a space already arrived.
You're right. And the truth of the reality is real impact starts on a local level. That's like the key nugget. Anyone that's doing anything remarkable in the world that's happening on a global scale, or they have an endeavor that's very well known, well publicized, whatever it is, all those people started small, and they built and they added on to that. They built their way up. They didn't start at the top. They started on a local level, and they grew. Confucius once said, I love this quote. He once said, cultivate oneself, put the family in order, govern the state, and pacify the world. I remember a friend of mine mentioned this quote to me, and I think Confucius had it right. What he's saying is, before we try to pacify the world, right, before we try to quote unquote change the world, we need to start by cultivating ourselves. And then from ourselves, once we've cultivated the right character and discipline, then we move to our family, then we move to our state, and then we move to the world. And so I think it's so important for us millennials, right? And not just millennials, anybody that's struggling with this idea of having to perform to keep up with the best of the best in the world. I think it's really important for us to remember to think big, but start small. That's how everybody in the world got started.
I think when we talk about our viewpoints in the West, the history of Western civilization, from my vantage point, has been the democratization of everything. So it's been taking things that once was only in the realm of people that had wealth and power, and it's been a story of distilling those things down to the common person's accessibility to them, whatever that is, right? We can look at the pathway in Western civilization as a democratization of everything. And I think at this point, to what we were talking about with fame earlier, Instagram and social media have almost democratized fame and importance. So at one time, 100 years ago, most people never expected themselves to be famous. I mean, even back then, it was very, very few people in newspapers, and then radio came online, 50 years later, whatever, and media came online. So there's these new openings for people to feel famous or important or prestigious, have not just the wealth that would come from being a wealthy person, many hundreds of years ago, but now wealth isn't as important as manufactured image and the democratization of what that wealthy person used to look like. We can all kind of look like that now from a fame standpoint. I mean, I'm being abstract a little out here, but it's a democratization of that. And I think that when we democratize something, we forget about hierarchies. We forget about the long tail or the bell curve where things cluster to the top. We forget about hierarchy, and we assume now, because we have the technology to democratize things, that's going to also translate to all the other factors that come in there, right? So I think this is something to where we haven't, as humans, at least in Western civilization, figured this piece out yet. And I think we're struggling with it a lot. And that competitive nature comes in the term of, the reason why competition enters into this is instinctively we know there's hierarchies to everything. Like you said, not everybody can be the best. And I don't know if we get that really in the West, because we have so much at our fingertips available, including fame. If you can get the right Instagram photos and game the system, and you know what you're doing with hashtags and posting and all this stuff and putting yourself in the right positions, it feels like everybody has accessibility to these things, but there is still a hierarchy in life. And there's competition that enters here, and there's this really interesting interplay with competition, but we shouldn't have to compete. We should all just have this. And that's not how reality works. And it really messes with our heads. And I think we're struggling with this concept. And I think then what happens is we almost feel like, this technology is available for me to get to a famous level or whatever. I mean, whatever the democratization is that I'm after in life, or we're after in life. And then there's this almost idea like I should just have that. And then we tend to want to skip steps to get there. We think, oh, this is so easy. I just do this thing on Instagram and that's going to make me famous, and then I'll have an impact, and then the next domino will kick over and all this other stuff will be going on for me. And then when someone gets to that level and maybe there's no substance there, it was all flash, now they're caught unawares. It's difficult. It's challenging because the thing that you game the system, basically. You skip steps. It was a technological advantage that wasn't natural. It was an unnatural process. And now this idea of skipping steps, like we almost have to force ourselves to go and do the things that would be the organic steps to get to the place we're getting synthetically as humans. And it causes this really weird dichotomous back and forth of like insecurity and competition and anxiety. And we don't know who, and quite frankly, I look at it as an identity crisis. We don't even know who we are anymore because of it too. Like we're just like, I should be this thing, but I'm not. So who am I and what am I? And all this anxiety comes in there. And I just look at it as a really difficult place to navigate for most people.
I think that we've gotten to a place where we even, just the idea that there is hierarchies everywhere is distasteful to society. Like just the idea of you're like, that's how reality works. It works in hierarchies. And I think because so much has been democratized, the idea that hierarchies are actually natural is a resistance against reality that we have right now. But I've noticed that in an attempt to create more of a horizontal relationship with everything, it's not that the hierarchies are going away, it's that they're just shifting. And the hierarchies themselves get maintained. It's just who gets to be the person who's on top and who gets to be the person who's on the bottom. That's really the question. And so I think this idea that there's no such thing as hierarchies or we can create a world without hierarchy, I don't see anything in nature that reflects how that works. Like we'd have to get to a point of like, I don't know, maybe when we hit the singularity, who knows? But for the time being, hierarchies are still a natural part of our wiring. And I say that as somebody who uses introverted thinking as an ENTP. I think introverted thinking has a very egalitarian perspective. I don't really like the idea of hierarchies at all, but I have to acknowledge that they're everywhere. So this concept of everyone, like everything should be flat and we all should be sort of the same, then ends up, I agree, it's almost like it creates a schizophrenic relationship, because the only way to do that is to attack a concept of like meritocracy, attacking like this idea that the best should rise to the top, because of course then you have a whole bunch of questions about what defines the best and how are we supposed to actually like know that the best rose to the top, because there could be mitigating circumstances with what that means. And so then you have this idea that there's no such thing as the best rising to the top, but while still having a desire to be there. There's that schizophrenic nature is this idea that I should be able to have that without having to work at it that hard. It should just be available. So I want it, but at the same time, because it should just be there, I should be able to skip steps and just get it. But then when somebody has worked for it, I'm resentful of that. And so like there's like all this conflict. I think society is really reflecting this really kind of conflicted narrative, or these conflicting narratives around what it means to be at the top, and whether or not we should all be there. And if everybody's there, then that actually, like you said, Nii, that means I am actually not there. If we all have fame, then nobody has fame. If we're all the best, then nobody's the best. We have to redefine our terms now. So there's this part of I want it, but I'm resentful it exists. And so what do I do about that? And as you mentioned, Joel, there's this almost identity crisis that comes up around it. I actually think of it as a lack of just general self-esteem, because one of the things I think we're forgetting in all of these messages is that when you work hard and then you get the return on your hard work, there is a sense of self-esteem that comes with it. And so the idea of just having it, when you get it and you haven't done the work for it, part of the payment is that you don't get that hit of self-esteem. You don't get that hit of like having done good work and feeling good for the work you've done. It's like the difference between having a body that you earned by going to the gym every day versus getting liposuction and then taking steroids. You're not going to have the same sense of I earned this. And we have a bunch of chemicals in our body that reward us when we earn something. And so, I mean, it's actually a rather complex subject, I think. I don't think this is cut and dry. I don't think it's something that almost could be filleted out in one conversation. There's so much to this and so much conflicting relationship with these concepts. But if I were to sort of parse it down to its fundamentals, I think one of the biggest challenges, or one of the leverage points in kind of getting back to a healthy relationship with this idea, is just remembering you can't skip steps. You just can't skip steps. And if you do skip steps through unnatural means, like as you mentioned, Joel, you're going to like you're going to have to pay the piper at some point. you will end up having challenges having arrived that were unanticipated. And I think of like celebrities or actors who have fame almost instantaneously overnight, and how often that goes off the rails for them. How often they have like major issues with fame, and they have like, they end up having drug problems or alcohol problems, or they just go, and it's like, man, that person just really went off the rails. Where'd they go? And it's because they got something that they didn't have the steps to acclimate to each level, and versus somebody who maybe came in through theater. And they're not just a flash in the pan overnight success. They're somebody who like built it up through theater. So they're used to having like audiences watch them and then come ask for their autographs afterward, but on a smaller scale. And then they just kind of keep going up that way. And then by the time they get to movies, they've figured out a way of dealing with the attention they're getting.
Yes, I think there's so many interesting topics here. A lot of people talk about, I want to make an impact in the world, and the assumption that we're making in that statement is that the impact is positive, right? There are lots of people that are making an impact in the world, and it's not a positive. It's not a net positive. It's hurting the world. And one of the ways we prevent that from happening is through character. The reason why those steps are so important is because that's the process of us developing our character. It's where we're refining our skills, we're getting perspective, we're accumulating the career capital or life capital we need to be able to be good stewards of the opportunity when it comes. When we have the chance to make, quote unquote, an impact in the world, we're ready to make an impact in the world. And what's tragic is when people are given the opportunity, right, whether it's because of luck or circumstances, and the opportunity destroys them, and it destroys their family, and it destroys their community, and it's because they skipped steps, and it's because they didn't have character, they didn't have integrity, and the opportunity that they were supposed to unpack to make the world a better place, it actually crushed them.
I think one of the things that you, Nii, have given me a lot of perspective on, we've had talks offline about this, there's an easy position for you, especially as an ENTJ, to look at your peers, people that are successful. You have some friends that have started companies, that have done some things that you're like, man, like we've had some conversations. I do too. I have some peers that I'm like, how are they so much further along than me in a lot of ways? And it's easy to get caught up in, there are probably things I could do, and maybe you could do too, and Antonia could do, to simulate the success that some of our peers have. And we could pull the trigger to do that and simulate that success. But I think going back and getting back to what you talked about, the local level, whatever it is that I can do now substantively in a career or business or a path forward, it feels like I'm losing when I do it. I feel like I'm not winning because they have the imaging that I want to have potentially, or we want to have as people. And I'm like, man, I feel to go work on this mundane thing and build this whatever project or whatever, feels like I'm not doing, like they're out there in the media, or they're getting their photo on this, or they're writing this, like, oh man, I'm losing. And I do feel the sense of, I don't think it's just millennials. I think a lot of us feel this. And it's so much discipline for me to put my head down and say, no. And this is kind of what we've been talking about recently on a lot of podcasts, surrender to the work, do the work, get back to the work, because it's like the tortoise and the hare. It's the tortoise plodding along ultimately will win out the race at the end of the day. And that hare can run ahead and get the photo op, a mile down the track, but it keeps stopping to get photo ops as the people who are really building something are just plodding along. And quite frankly, I think that is like something in here is the key for this. And it's interesting to see how it takes character to build character. And as you build character, you have more character. And it's hard work to pull yourself off that rabbit trail and put yourself on the tortoise trail and just plug along at the position you're at right now. All of us, I'm not saying you particularly, Nii, all of us, I think it's tough to do. And it takes immense amount of discipline and trust and faith that you're going to get there if you keep doing this and keep moving the progress along where you can and not skipping steps. And that lesson is wise. Like that's a hard lesson to learn. And when we learn that as people, that's where I think true success is created for us.
That idea of character is so important, I think, because, I mean, even to what you were just talking about, Joel, which is that there's the tortoise and the hare situation. Even the people who I look around that are my peers who have done better than I have, I don't necessarily think that they're not on a good path. Like they aren't necessarily the people who like are stopping all the time to take photo ops, right? Like I don't necessarily feel like they're doing it wrong and I'm doing it right. I don't think that's what you were implying, but I think that's something that could be read into by hearing what you were talking about. And I feel like it's one of those things where when I don't hyper focus on what's going on around me and I just focus on my path and what it is I'm supposed to be doing, and that concept of building character and doing it slowly it's right for me. That's really right for me. And so when I hear ideas around hierarchy and meritocracy and all those concepts, and I kind of hear like sort of a schizophrenic message in society around that. I don't really get that triggered by it because I'm on a path, right? Like if I get fame, cool. If I don't get fame, cool. If I make a big quote unquote impact in the world, cool. If I don't, that's fine too. But I'm living a life that is so rewarding to me right now, and I keep calibrating to a rewarding presence, right? Like the present moment is so rewarding to me that I feel like wherever this trajectory leads me, I think it's probably going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm pretty philosophical. So if it's not okay, then that's going to be okay too. Like it's all going to pan out fine, right? Even though I know it all ends in my death. It ends in my death, and that's going to be fine as well. So I think it gets really philosophical at a certain point. But that said, I feel like this idea of like I've got this message that I'm supposed to make an impact in the world, and it's supposed to be profound, and I'm getting this message that all my friends are doing all these big things and I've got to do those too. And also at the same time, I feel like fame should be democratized. Like we should all have access to it. And then at the same time, I also feel like I should just get certain things. But then at the same time, when I get there, I want it to be special for me because that was the thing I was supposed to do from the original message, which was to create impact and have fame. So it's like all this stuff is so complex and confusing and like, oh. And when it comes right down to it, like you mentioned, I think you hit the nail on the head, Nii. Really, when it comes down to it at the end of the day is character and building character. And if you are focused on building character, which is, of course, a few podcasts ago, I mentioned I'm so much more about personal development than I'm about societal issues. Because I feel like if you focus on that concept of character, when you have the opportunity to make a positive impact, then you'll be ready for that moment. And like you said, Nii, if you make an impact, it's not always going to be positive. If your character isn't ready for those moments, then when you make an impact, it might be really detrimental, which is something we're seeing in society too. We're seeing all sorts of really bad impact that people have made that are currently being railed against. And like, and what do we do about that, right? Because we've set up certain people that maybe shouldn't have been, set up or put like heightened in celebritydom. So it's like, just because you're a celebrity doesn't mean that that's necessarily net positive. Mm-hmm. Like that doesn't mean anything. So focusing on the individual growth and character so that as you have these opportunities, which start small, start local, self, family, local, then world, which is a great quote. I think as you move into those moments, you'll be ready for them. So it's less about I should have that. And then the perspective shifts to, if I were to have that, would I be ready for that? And would I be doing as like the assumption is that I already would be positive if I were put in that place, but I don't think that that's the right assumption. The assumption is I should be working on myself now, so when I get there, it will be positive.
To your point, this is why the message of personal growth is so important. There are so many challenges in the world right now. There's so many problems and challenges in our world, and I think this is a really great reason why personal development is important, because if we want to have the tools to make an impact, a positive impact in the world, then we have work to do. And I think that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about our mission here at Personality Hacker, and even tools like the Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram or Strengths Finders. These are tools that can help us understand who we are and help us understand our strengths, help us understand our character, and we can be working on ourselves until the opportunity comes. And
So I think the reason why we desire as humans, so I'm going to bring some introverted feeling into here. I think the reason we desire to make an impact in the world is not to make an impact in the world. I think it's to look back on our life and to tell ourselves on our deathbed or later in life or when we're wrapping up or even in the midst of our life, my life mattered. I was significant. I like the life I led, the life I lived mattered. It made a difference. It mattered in some way. It was in some way significant. I think that's really what we're after as people. At the core, we want to feel a sense of significance, and that our vessel of blood and bones and brain and skin and attention and work, it meant something. I think that's really what we're after. And when we can understand that I think that's what we're after, the only person that can actually tell you that your life mattered is you. Because at the end of the day, you are the most intimate person with yourself. And this notion of competition and looking to make an impact in the world, even that's kind of a competitive frame in some ways. It's this notion of, well, the world around me has to tell me that I mattered. If they don't tell me I mattered, then I didn't matter. And I think that we as people have to understand that the reason why personal growth is so powerful and important in all of this is we're the only person that can answer that question about ourselves. Like society will tell us a bunch of messages. And often it's been my experience, I have to ignore the messages I'm getting from the outside world because I'm the only one that knows who I am and what I'm about and who I'm about. And this is something that it speaks to this personal growth element, is that if you work on yourself and you understand this, at the end of your life, you're going to be able to answer that question about the matter or the significance that you brought to the world, because that's the person you're asking is you. And I think there's this internal, external, and I think that, again, this probably comes down to personality type in some ways. It's probably more obvious to some personality types than others and could be overvalued by some. Like I could overvalue that in myself and then not care at all what society thinks, and I don't even like comb my hair, I don't brush my teeth, or, they could go to complete extremes, like, screw this, I don't care what anybody thinks. But ultimately, I think that's really where this floating benchmark is. And I think that's also why we have such a struggle with identity, is because we're outsourcing our significance to the rest of the world, and they're not giving us the message we need back. And we're going, oh God, who am I? What am I about? What is my significance? I don't know. I don't even know who I am. And we start to question our identities. We start to question ourselves. We question our value in the world, and we get anxious and upset and competitive, and we have to prove ourselves. And I think it really stems from this of the fundamental question we're asking is, did my life matter? Am I significant? And I think if we can focus in on that, I think then that is a foundation to build this idea of making an impact in the world. And if you don't make an impact in the world, do you still matter? Was your life significant? That's the other question. Like, what if you don't get the opportunity for whatever reason? Circumstances, health, time runs out, you get in a car accident and die when you're 25 and you didn't get to have that impact. Does that mean you were not a significant person? And I think that's something we also struggle with in the West here. Probably it's a human thing in the East too. I'm sure it's all over the world. I'm sure it's not just a Western thing, but it's heightened by social media and these things that create that competition.
Adding to what you're saying about insecurity and wondering at the end of your life, did my life matter? I think part of the lingering insecurity that so many people feel stems from not going through the steps. One of the things that's so powerful about going through the steps and working your way up is, one, it gives us character because we're getting these wins along the way, but it also gives us confidence. Those small wins along the way, they give us confidence. We're able to put ourselves out there and have a successful result or outcome, learn from it, and it boosts our confidence. And we work our way up and we work our way up and we work our way up until we get to a place where we're making a quote unquote big impact on the world. And we also have the confidence in knowing that our lives matter. I think that's part of the reason why those steps are so important. But when we feel the urge to skip those steps because we want to catch up with everybody else we see on social media, it creates this persistent insecurity because we're not actually sure whether we can do it. We haven't tested ourselves. We haven't forged our character through the fire. And I think unconsciously we know that. And so what happens is we're constantly looking around for validation to know whether we're good enough, whether we're doing the right thing. And so much of that can be resolved by honoring the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is such a great conversation. I think also, though, that's we did a podcast on a model called the HAT Model long time ago, which is this idea that personal development is separated into 3 different categories of healing, achievement, and transcendence. And we're talking about achievement, personal development, but then you kick over into transcendence, personal development. You start working on your ego, and then you realize it kind of doesn't matter if you're significant. It sort of doesn't matter. If you're present in your world and your life and you sort of surrender to what's happening around you, then you let go of this idea of having to have this significance. You let go of the idea of having to have made an impact. And you just enjoy the ride. You just go through the ride for what it is. But you can't, I don't think you can get there. I think that's skipping steps. I think if you go from a place of insecurity around your insignificance and you try to go straight to, well, it doesn't matter, I think you're actually missing a step. And I think the step you're missing is going through the character building part of self-affirming that you matter and you're making an impact and the things about you are good and positive. And what's so great about going through that step of building character, like you're mentioning, is that on the other side of that is the possibility of just being. Like you don't have to be validated in all these different ways. You don't have to be validated by the outside world or even self-validated. You just go, oh, this is just what it is. And that's a place of some serious inner peace. So I think that's what's nice about hitting that step is that now you qualify for some ego work when you just go, oh, it is what it is.
Well, you got esoteric real quick, didn't you?
I know, I get so philosophical. Do we feel like this is a great conversation, Nii? I'm so grateful that you were willing to do a second follow-up podcast based on that great conversation we had. But I just want to, before we close up shop here, I just want to make sure that everybody feels complete and they got to say the things that they wanted to say.
Yeah, I feel great. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, I think it's been a good conversation. And I know there's one person that hasn't gotten to say what they want to say yet, and that's you listening. Now is your chance to come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard. Tell us your story. What's coming up for you as we talk about this, as we talk about not skipping steps, as we talk about things being democratized like fame, the pressure you might feel for competition, this idea of having a significant life or maybe even transcending that idea. But we want to hear from you around this notion, and probably the comments would be great to be focused in on careers, because that's kind of the topic we're talking about is how does this inform what you do with your life? Because even to your point, Antonia, of it, well, significance doesn't matter. I can just be. There's not a lot of money in just being. Sometimes you have to like actually do something to like make a living, right? You can't, there's no like job description be, quote unquote, unless you're like, I guess, a monk on a mountain getting your fingers chewed off by rats, but that's a whole nother topic. Long story short, it's got to be something that we do in life to generate resource for ourselves. And we all have this challenge of having to generate the resource to sustain our lives. And that often ends up in a job and career. And then we connect that to something that's meaningful for us. Something that actually, when we, Nii talked about in the last episode, this idea it's not just a 9-to-5 workday. We have to get ready for work. And after work, we come home and unwind. And everything seems to be centered upon the work and career we have in our lives. So that's a significant aspect of our lives. And in the context of a career or the work we do, how are some of these ideas resonating with you? Or what are some things coming up for you? What are stories you could share with us and other people of like minds in the community? I think a lot of people would love to hear your story and can learn from it. So come over to personalityhacker.com. Leave your comments, ask your questions, and be a part of this community and this discussion.
I think you should speak for yourself. I think I get paid for just being. Or at least that's what you accuse me of sometimes. Nii, thank you so much again for joining us. I'm hoping that you'll be a contributor to our conversation again in the future, so thanks again. And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating and review on iTunes, that's extremely helpful to us, so please go do that. And we have a book. Go buy it, love it, and write a review for us on Amazon. That also helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast.